Somewhere beneath the hills outside Tehran, a concrete door built to survive almost anything on Earth was not enough. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal in early April of 2026, American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flew a round-trip mission all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and hostile airspace, and released 30,000-pound GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator bombs onto an underground Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command bunker near Tehran. That is the moment this story centers on. But before we go further, we owe you honesty about timing, because that matters more than drama. This was not a strike that happened this morning. It happened months ago, in the middle of a much longer campaign, and understanding where it fits in that campaign is the only way to actually understand what it means. Let's set the scene properly, because the full picture only makes sense once you see how far back this actually goes. Tehran has spent decades building underground infrastructure specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of attack American air power is built to deliver. Command bunkers, missile storage, nuclear enrichment halls, all buried under rock and reinforced concrete, on the theory that depth itself is a kind of armor. For most of that time, the theory held. Then, on the night of June 21st into June 22nd of 2025, in an operation the Pentagon named Midnight Hammer, that theory was tested directly. According to General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who briefed reporters at the Pentagon days after the strike, 7 B-2 Spirit bombers took part in what was described as the largest and longest B-2 combat mission since the war in Afghanistan began in 2001. 6 of those bombers targeted Iran's Fordow enrichment facility, a site dug so deep into a mountain that, for years, analysts openly debated whether any conventional weapon on Earth could reach it. The 7th bomber struck the Natanz complex. 14 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators were dropped in total, 12 on Fordow and 2 on Natanz, according to Kane's own account. A U.S. submarine operating separately in the region launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at a third site, the Isfahan nuclear facility. In total, the operation employed roughly 75 precision-guided weapons and more than 125 aircraft, according to Defense Security Monitor's reporting based on Pentagon briefings. That June 2025 mission mattered because it was the first time the GBU-57 had ever been used in actual combat. This bomb had existed on paper and in testing since the mid-2000s, developed by the Air Force alongside the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, specifically because officials feared exactly the kind of deeply buried facility Iran was building at Fordow. It is a satellite and inertial guided penetrator, roughly 30,000 pounds over 20 feet long, with a steel casing engineered to punch through layer after layer of rock and reinforced concrete before its fuse allows it to detonate, sometimes as deep as 200 feet underground. According to Air and Space Forces magazine's account of Kane's Pentagon briefing, the bombing sequence at Fordow was deliberate and layered. The first bombs blew the concrete covers off 2 main ventilation shafts. The next 4 penetrated deep into the underground facility itself. A 6th bomb per shaft was a backup in case of a weapons failure. The goal was not simply to blow a hole in the ground, but to generate what officials called an overpressure effect, a shockwave that travels through rock and concrete to destroy equipment far from the actual point of impact. Satellite imagery released afterward by Maxar Technologies showed large craters along the ridge above Fordow, tunnel entrances blocked by collapsed earth, and a layer of gray-blue ash across the site. But even here, honesty matters. A senior U.S. official, speaking anonymously to the New York Times shortly after the strike, acknowledged that the Fordow facility was severely damaged but not completely destroyed. That nuance got lost in a lot of the noise after the strike, but it is one of the more important verified caveats in this entire story, and we are not going to smooth it over. Now fast forward past that summer, past a period of uneasy quiet, and into 2026. According to a spotlight page published by the U.S. Department of War on February 28, 2026, the United States military commenced a new campaign, this time under the name Operation Epic Fury, under direct presidential order with U.S. and partner forces striking targets across Iran, aimed at what the department described as dismantling the Iranian regime's security apparatus and prioritizing locations assessed as posing an imminent threat. This was not a limited one-night raid like Midnight Hammer had been. This was the opening of a sustained air campaign, one that a day-by-day conflict tracker maintained by Global Security. ORG describes as unfolding across roughly 40 days of active combat operations, before a ceasefire, brokered with Pakistani mediation, took hold on April 8, 2026. Inside that 40-day window, the intensity escalated fast. By the campaign's 14th day, March 13, 2026, Brent crude oil prices had breached $100 a barrel for the second time since the war began, according to the same Global Security. ORG Tracker, driven in part by a public statement from Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, vowing that the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed as what he called a tool to pressure the enemy. The International Energy Agency had already approved what the tracker describes as the largest coordinated strategic oil reserve release in history, 400 million barrels, and it still was not enough to fully offset trader anxiety, because roughly 20 million barrels a day normally move through that single waterway. In the same 48-hour window in mid-March, 3 more commercial vessels were struck in the Persian Gulf, bringing the cumulative total of attacked ships since February 28th to more than 22, and a U.S. Air Force KC-135 refueling tanker crashed in western Iraq, the 4th American aircraft lost since the campaign began. Fox News' own live coverage from that period captured a similar picture on the ground, reporting that a missile struck a helipad inside the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad, and that Israeli forces announced they had killed 2 senior Iranian intelligence officials who had only days earlier been appointed to replace officials killed previously in the campaign. It's against that backdrop, in the first days of April 2026, that the bunker buster strike named in this story's title actually took place. According to the Wall Street Journal's reporting, and as detailed by Army Recognition's Defense Desk, Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Command, ordered the B-2 mission after intelligence reportedly identified a large concentration of senior IRGC commanders gathered inside an underground bunker near Tehran. This was described not as a pre-planned strike against a static, long-known facility the way Fordow had been, but as a dynamic, time-sensitive attack against a fleeting leadership target, one whose value depended entirely on hitting it before the people inside could disperse. That distinction matters, because it points to a completely different kind of military capability than the one demonstrated in June 2025. Midnight Hammer showed that the United States could plan for months and then execute a single, devastating strike against a known fixed target. The Tehran bunker strike, by contrast, showed a compressed kill chain, intelligence collection, command authorization, bomber tasking out of the continental United States, aerial refueling, and terminal weapons delivery, all happening fast enough to catch a moving, time-limited opportunity. And, remarkably, that strike did not happen in isolation. According to separate Wall Street Journal reporting cited by Army Recognition, the same general window also included an active combat search and rescue operation, an effort to recover a downed American F-15E Strike Eagle airman inside Iranian territory. American bombers reportedly dropped roughly 100 2,000-pound class bombs during that recovery effort specifically to prevent Iranian forces from converging on the rescue site. So in the same operational period, U.S. forces were simultaneously shielding a personnel recovery corridor, disrupting Iranian ground movement toward that corridor, and exploiting a narrow intelligence window to strike a hardened IRGC command bunker with the same class of weapon first used against Fordow. The aviationists' coverage from early August 2026 adds a grim postscript to that rescue story. Iranian state media displayed what it described as wreckage from that same downed F-15E, tail number Moyuz 3000, recovered from a jet reportedly shot down in early April, alongside wreckage from American MQ-1 and MQ-9 drones lost during the campaign. As of that August 8, 2026 report, the whereabouts of the F-15E's 2 crew members remained unknown. We want to be direct about something here. That detail comes from Iranian state media, and it has not been independently verified by Western outlets in the reporting we found, so we are flagging it as unconfirmed rather than presenting it as settled fact. Let's talk about why the weapon itself matters so much. Because the GBU-57 is not a generic bomb, and the fact that it was used twice, first against a nuclear enrichment facility and later against a leadership bunker, tells you something about how seriously American planners take the underground threat specifically inside Iran. According to Wikipedia's technical entry on the GBU-57, cross-referenced with Air Force fact sheets, the weapon is officially classified in the 30,000-pound class, just over 20 feet long, with a filling weight of roughly 4,500 pounds of high explosive packed inside a purpose-built penetrating steel casing. Guidance comes from a combination of GPS updates and an internal inertial navigation system, which keeps the weapon accurate against fixed coordinates, even if satellite signal is degraded or jammed. Only the B-2 Spirit can carry it operationally, up to 2 bombs per aircraft, which is part of why this bomber, first built during the Cold War, remains central to any conversation about hitting deeply buried facilities anywhere in the world. And the story didn't end with these 2 strikes. According to Defense News and a separate report from Army Recognition, both published in February 2026, the U.S. Air Force awarded Boeing, the only qualified manufacturer of the GBU-57, a sole source contract worth more than $100 million, specifically to replenish the bunker buster inventory expended during the June 2025 Fordow strikes. Officials cited in the justification notice warned that any delay in that contract would directly harm Air Force Global Strike Command's operational readiness. Delivery of the new tail kits and full weapon assemblies is expected to begin in January 2028. which tells you plainly that the Pentagon does not consider this a one-time tool. It considers it a core, ongoing part of how it plans to deal with hardened targets and future contingencies, in Iran or anywhere else. The bunker buster campaign against Iran also wasn't limited to the giant 30,000-pound MOP. According to reporting from the War Zone published in March 2026, the U.S. Air Force also employed its newer 5,000-pound class GBU-57 Penetrator against underground Iranian sites holding coastal defense and anti-ship cruise missiles. Targets, CENTCOM said in a post on social media, were struck because those missiles, in the command's words, posed a risk to international shipping through the strait. That same report noted GBU-31 JDAMs fitted with 2,000-pound class BLU-109 bunker buster warheads were already in very active ongoing use against targets across Iran, observed being loaded onto B-52 and B-1 bombers at bases including RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom. So what you're really looking at, when you zoom out, is a tiered arsenal, small penetrators for missile storage sites, medium penetrators for hardened bunkers, and the enormous GBU-57 reserved specifically for the deepest, most fortified nuclear and command infrastructure Iran possesses. Now here's the part of this story that a lot of coverage online tends to skip past, and it's the part that actually matters most if you're trying to understand where things stand today on the day we're recording this. The Tehran bunker strike and the broader Epic Fury air campaign did not continue indefinitely. According to the White House's own April 2026 statement titled Peace Through Strength, the administration declared that Operation Epic Fury had, in its words, crushed the Iranian threat, claiming roughly 70% of Iran's satellite launch facilities and ground control stations had been destroyed or degraded, and describing a ceasefire taking hold as of early April. The global security org daily tracker lays out the phases plainly. The initial strike on February 28th that opened the conflict. 40 days of active combat that concluded with the Pakistan-brokered ceasefire on April 8th, a U.S. naval blockade announcement and enforcement effort beginning April 13th, a brief Project Freedom convoy operation on May 4th that reportedly paused within 24 hours, a formal May 5th declaration that Operation Epic Fury itself was complete, and then what the tracker calls a post-ceasefire diplomatic phase, featuring both a Pakistani mediation track and what it describes as an emerging Beijing-based mediation effort as well. And that diplomatic phase is still where things stand as of this week. According to that same conflict tracker, on August 7th, 2026, President Trump told reporters the war has, in his words, got to end pretty soon, adding that he does not believe Iran can go much longer, while Bloomberg separately reported that a draft Iran-Oman text was, at that point, under review inside Iran's own parliament, according to Iranian outlet Fars. We want to flag that specific detail clearly. Fars is Iranian state media. Its reporting on internal Iranian parliamentary deliberations has not been independently confirmed by Reuters, the Associated Press, or other wire services in what we found. So treat that particular claim as reported by one side rather than confirmed fact. Just days before that, on August 3rd, the same tracker reports that President Trump canceled a threatened multi-day air campaign against Iran that he had floated only 2 days earlier, posting that the United States remained, in his words, locked and loaded, but said it had held off at the request of Iran and other regional states because, as he put it, the perimeters of a deal had been agreed, with Israel reportedly involved in that same discussion. So to be completely transparent with you about what this title actually means, the United States did drop a massive bunker buster bomb on a target near Tehran. That part is real. It's documented by the Wall Street Journal and corroborated by defense trade press, including Army Recognition and The Aviationist. But it happened in early April of 2026 as part of the closing days of a 40-day war, not as a fresh, breaking event today. As of this week, the guns around Tehran have been quiet for months, replaced by tense diplomacy, a possible Iran-Oman brokered framework, and a president publicly signaling he wants the war finished rather than restarted. That distinction is not a small technicality. It is the difference between a channel that respects your time and your trust and one that recycles old footage with a new thumbnail to make you think something is happening right now when it isn't. To really understand why Tehran ended up in the crosshairs of a 30,000-pound bunker buster in the first place, you have to go back further than 2025. According to the State Department's own legal justification for Operation Epic Fury, released by the Office of the Legal Advisor in April 2026, Washington's position is that the armed conflict between Israel and Iran did not begin in February 2026, or even in June 2025. The State Department traces what it describes as Iran's continuing pattern of attacks back to at least 2019 through 2024, and argues that repeated but ultimately fruitless negotiation attempts, both early in the Trump administration and again in late 2025 and early 2026, never actually brought that underlying conflict to a close. In the department's own words, no party involved, not Iran, not Israel, not the United States, ever formally decided the conflict had ended after the June 2025 strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. That legal framing matters because it's the argument the administration used to justify resuming offensive operations under Operation Epic Fury 7 months later, treating February 28, 2026 not as the start of an entirely new war, but as a continuation of one that, in Washington's telling, had never actually stopped. Israel made a parallel argument in its own communications, according to the same State Department document, formally telling the United Nations Security Council in a March 10, 2026 letter that the armed conflict with Iran had been ongoing since at least that earlier period, and quite possibly years before that. That deeper history includes a nuclear program that had been drifting toward weapons-grade material for years before any bombs fell in 2025 or 2026, a live conflict tracking dashboard, cross-referencing IAEA inspection data, notes that once the 2015 nuclear agreement's constraints effectively fell away, Iran steadily accelerated uranium enrichment, reaching 60% purity, far above the roughly 4% needed for civilian power reactors, and edging toward the 90% threshold generally considered weapons grade by May of 2025. It's also worth remembering, for context, that the broader U.S. Iran relationship has been shaped by flashpoints stretching back years, including the killing of Iranian Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani in a U.S. strike, an event Iran responded to at the time with ballistic missile strikes on American bases in Iraq, and one that the same dashboard describes as having crossed what it calls a psychological red line in the relationship between the two countries. None of that history excuses or explains away any single strike on its own, but it does explain why, when American and Israeli officials looked at Fordow's uranium stockpile in the spring of 2025, they were not evaluating an abstract future risk. They were looking at what the IAEA itself formally assessed as material sufficient, if further enriched, for multiple nuclear devices, sitting inside a facility that had been engineered specifically to be immune to exactly the kind of air power Israel could bring to bear on its own. It's also worth spending a moment on the regional picture beyond just Iran and the immediate battlefield, because a war like this one doesn't unfold in a vacuum. Fox News' live coverage from the first 2 weeks of Operation Epic Fury captured the pace of escalation in real time. On the campaign's 7th day in early March 2026, President Trump asserted that U.S. forces continued to, in his words, totally demolish Iranian forces, while CENTCOM stated publicly that American forces were not holding back from a mission aimed at sinking, in the command's phrasing, the entire Iranian Navy. That same coverage reported that India was allowing an Iranian naval vessel experiencing mechanical problems to dock at the port of Kochi, a small but telling detail about how neutral and regional states were being pulled into logistics decisions around a conflict they had no direct stake in. By the campaign's 14th day in mid-March, the Israeli military reported it had carried out roughly 400 separate waves of airstrikes across Iran, targeting missile and air defense systems, according to the IDF's own public statements relayed through Fox News Live blog, underscoring that this was never a purely American operation. It was a coordinated two-country air campaign, with the United States uniquely positioned, because of the GBU-57 and the B-2, to reach targets that Israeli air power alone could not touch. Let's step back and put some numbers around the human and financial cost of everything that led up to that Tehran bunker strike. Because a story like this can't just be about steel casings and flight paths out of Missouri. A live conflict dashboard tracking the broader U.S. Israel-Iran war, cross-referencing IAEA reporting, notes that by May of 2025, before any of this year's fighting even began, Iran had already enriched uranium to 60% purity, far above what's needed for civilian power generation, and had stockpiled more than 400 kilograms of that material, an amount the International Atomic Energy Agency assessed was enough, if further enriched, for somewhere between 4 and 9 nuclear warheads, depending on which agency estimate you use. The IAEA formally declared Iran in material breach of its non-proliferation treaty obligations on June 12, 2025, just 10 days before Operation Midnight Hammer. And crucially, since the Israeli and American strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure began, the IAEA has been unable to conduct on-the-ground verification of Iran's current enrichment levels or the location of that stockpiled material. As of the most recent reporting we could find, Iran's precise nuclear status and the location of that highly enriched uranium remains unknown to international inspectors. That is arguably the single most consequential unresolved question hanging over this entire 18-month story. And no bunker buster bomb, however massive, has definitively answered it. On the human toll, we want to be careful here, because casualty figures in active conflicts are notoriously difficult to verify, and different sources report very different numbers depending on timing and methodology. Reporting, compiled by a democracy. Now, citing a consortium of human rights groups operating inside Iran, put the civilian death toll from combined U.S. and Israeli strikes at close to 1,500 people by late March 2026, including more than 200 children, according to that consortium's tally. We're presenting that figure because it comes from a named group of human rights organizations working the story, but we want to be honest that we could not independently cross-verify that exact number against a second, separate source. So treat it as a reported estimate rather than a confirmed count. What is independently confirmed, again through the Global Security Org Daily Tracker, is the toll on the American side in equipment and personnel exposure. At least 4 U.S. aircraft lost during the February to April combat window alone, including that KC-135 tanker crash in western Iraq, and the F-15E Strike Eagle shot down during the rescue operation tied to the Tehran bunker strike, plus multiple MQ-1 and MQ-9 drone losses that Iranian state media has since put on public display as, in effect, propaganda trophies. It's worth pausing here to explain, in plain terms, why the Fordow facility was considered such a uniquely difficult target in the first place, because that engineering detail is really the whole reason the GBU-57 exists at all. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Fordow was built into the side of a mountain near the city of Qom, specifically so that its centrifuge halls would sit under enough rock to defeat any bunker buster available at the time of its construction. For more than a decade, the central question preoccupying Western military planners, as Air and Space Forces magazine's own reporting on General Kane's Pentagon briefing put it, was simple. How do you destroy a complex buried that deep beneath a mountain? In the United States specifically, gasoline prices crossed $4 a gallon for the first time since 2022 during the same period, a direct consequence of the Strait of Hormuz tensions and the broader Gulf shipping disruptions we mentioned earlier, with more than 22 commercial vessels attacked in Gulf waters during the height of the campaign. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, addressing reporters during that period, suggested the administration could ask Arab nations to help cover war costs, drawing a direct comparison to how Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates helped fund the U.S.-led coalition during the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War. It's also worth addressing, honestly, the disagreement among experts and officials over how effective the June 2025 Fordow strike actually was, because that debate never fully resolved. And it's directly relevant to why a second bunker buster mission near Tehran happened again less than a year later. Research published by Finabel, a European defense and security organization, describes Operation Midnight Hammer as involving genuine dispute between what it calls a tactical triumph and a strategic illusion. On one side, official U.S. accounts pointed to satellite imagery, blocked tunnel entrances, and confirmed craters as evidence of major damage. On the other, Israeli sources cited in the same Finabel analysis expressed a more cautious view of how completely the underground enrichment halls had actually been destroyed, a caution that lines up with the New York Times' own reporting that a senior anonymous U.S. official acknowledged the site was severely damaged but not fully destroyed. That unresolved uncertainty about Fordow's actual condition is a big part of why the IAEA's continued inability to physically inspect the site matters so much. Without inspectors on the ground, nobody outside Iran's own government can say with full confidence whether enrichment capacity at that facility could theoretically be restored, which is precisely the kind of open question a diplomatic framework like the reported Iran-Oman text would need to address directly if it's going to hold over the long term. Zooming out even further, it's worth asking what all of this tells us about the strategic logic behind targeting underground facilities near Tehran in the first place, because that logic didn't start in 2025 or 2026. It goes back decades. Iranian planners built facilities like Fordow deep inside a mountain, specifically because depth was assumed to be its own form of protection against exactly the kind of airstrike Israel, without a weapon like the GBU-57 in its own arsenal, could not deliver on its own. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Israel had, in fact, reportedly requested that the United States complete the mission specifically because Israeli forces lacked a bunker buster capable of reaching Fordow's depth. That's a detail worth sitting with, because it explains why American involvement, rather than Israeli action alone, became the pivotal factor in reaching that particular target. It also explains why the Tehran command bunker strike in April 2026 matters beyond its immediate tactical value. If underground IRGC leadership facilities near the capital are no longer assumed safe from American precision strikes, that forces a broader rethink inside Iran's security establishment about dispersal, redundancy, and communications discipline for senior commanders going forward, a point Army Recognition's own defense analysis specifically raised in its coverage of the strike. We also want to walk through, briefly, what happened to the aircraft and crews involved in carrying out these missions, because the risk wasn't one-sided. And honest reporting means acknowledging both the reach of American air power and its real limits and losses. The B-2 Spirit itself, first developed during the Cold War specifically to penetrate heavily defended Soviet airspace, remains one of the only aircraft in the world capable of carrying the GBU-57 internally while maintaining a low observable radar profile. Launching these missions directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, rather than from a forward base closer to the Gulf, was itself a deliberate signal, according to Army Recognition's analysis, demonstrating that the United States can generate this kind of combat power straight from the American homeland, sustain a round-trip sortie across intercontinental distances through aerial refueling, strike deep inside Iranian territory near Tehran, and return without depending on regional basing arrangements that could be politically constrained or physically exposed to retaliation. But that reach came with real cost elsewhere in the campaign, as we've already detailed. The tanker crash in Iraq, the F-15E shoot-down and rescue operation, and multiple drone losses that Iranian media has used as recently as this month for its own information warfare purposes by displaying recovered wreckage. So where does that leave things, sitting here in August 2026? Operation Epic Fury, in the Pentagon's own framing, is officially complete, declared finished as of May 5th. The Tehran bunker strike and the Fordow raid before it both stand as the two clearest demonstrations to date of the GBU-57's actual battlefield use, and both are now historical events rather than ongoing operations. What remains genuinely live, according to the most recent reporting we found, is the diplomatic track, a possible Iran-Oman framework reportedly under review inside Iran's parliament, a president publicly saying the war needs to end soon, and a canceled air campaign that suggests both sides are, for now, choosing negotiation over renewed bombing. Whether that framework holds, whether Iran's actual nuclear material and enrichment capacity ever gets independently verified again by the IAEA, and whether facilities like Fordow get rebuilt, relocated, or abandoned altogether, are all questions that remain genuinely open. And anyone telling you they know the answer with certainty right now is getting ahead of what's actually been confirmed. Before we wrap up, let's be transparent about exactly where every claim in this video came from, because that transparency is the whole point of doing this properly. The details of the April 2026 Tehran IRGC bunker strike come primarily from Wall Street Journal reporting as relayed and analyzed by Army Recognition's Defense Desk. The June 2025 Fordow and Natanz strike details come from Pentagon briefings delivered by General Dan Kane and Secretary Pete Hegseth, as reported by CBS News, Air and Space Forces Magazine, The War Zone, and Defense Security Monitor. The broader Operation Epic Fury timeline, including the February 28th start date, the April 8th ceasefire, and the current August 2026 diplomatic status, comes from the U.S. Department of War's own public spotlight page and from Global Security, Org's day-by-day conflict tracker. The GBU-57's technical specifications come from Air Force fact sheets and cross-referenced open-source technical documentation. Weapons procurement details, including the Boeing replenishment contract, come from Defense News and Army Recognition. The IAEA enrichment and stockpile figures come from IAEA assessments, as compiled by a dedicated conflict tracking dashboard. Economic figures, including the IMF warning, and U.S. gas prices, along with a disputed civilian casualty estimate, come from Democracy Now!'s coverage, and we've flagged that casualty figure specifically as an estimate from a named rights consortium rather than an independently confirmed count. And the claim about the missing F-15E crew members comes from Iranian state media, as reported by The Aviationist, which we flagged as unverified by independent Western sources. Where sources disagreed, or where a claim rested on a single outlet or state media, we told you directly, rather than presenting everything with the same false confidence. What strikes us most, putting this whole timeline together, is how much distance there is between the dramatic thumbnail version of a story like this and the actual layered reality underneath it. A massive bunker buster bomb genuinely was used against a target near Tehran. That's not manufactured. But it happened as one moment inside a much longer, messier campaign, one that started with a nuclear facility raid in June 2025, escalated into a 40-day war in early 2026, and has, for now, settled into a fragile diplomatic standoff that could still go either way. So here's the honest, open question we'll leave you with. Given everything we've just laid out, the strikes, the ceasefire, the unresolved uranium stockpile, and a president publicly pushing for an end to this before it restarts, do you think the diplomatic track currently underway between the United States, Oman, and Iran actually holds this time? Or do you think we're watching a pause rather than a genuine ending? Let us know what you think, and thank you for watching all the way through.